Money has a way of speaking truths that people won't. That's what I learned the day I checked our joint account and found $60,000 missing. Just gone, like smoke through fingers, without a trace or explanation. I'm Victoria, and until that moment, I thought I knew my husband Lucas. We met at a charity gala 8 years ago, married within a year, and had our daughter Sophie soon after. He was the charming real estate agent who could sell ice to Eskimos, as my mother Elaine loved to say. I was the sensible school counselor who helped troubled teens find their way. We balanced each other perfectly, or so I believed. There must be some mistake, I muttered, refreshing the banking app again. The numbers didn't change. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the transaction history, finding a series of withdrawals spread over 3 months, each just small enough to fly under my radar. I called the bank first, hoping for a system error or fraud alert. The representative's voice carried that practiced sympathy that made my stomach sink. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett, but these were all authorized transactions made with the correct credentials and security measures." The house felt different when Lucas came home that evening, like the walls had secrets they were dying to tell. He breezed through the door in his tailored suit, that $1,000,000 smile fixed firmly in place. "How's my favorite girl?" He kissed Sophie's forehead as she showed him her latest drawing. "And there's my beautiful wife." He moved to kiss me, but I turned my cheek. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice level for Sophie's sake. "Sophie, sweetheart, why don't you go finish your homework upstairs?" Lucas's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Everything okay?" I waited until Sophie's footsteps faded upstairs. $60,000, Lucas. Want to tell me where it went?" He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that! I was going to tell you soon. It's for your anniversary surprise. 10 years together deserves something special, don't you think? Our anniversary isn't for 4 months." I pulled up the banking app. "And these withdrawals started 3 months ago." "Victoria, honey, you're making this into something it's not." He loosened his tie, that familiar gesture that usually meant he was settling in for the evening. Now it looked like preparation for battle. "The market's been crazy. I had to move some money around for a few deals. It'll all be back with interest before you know it." "Move money around? Without telling me?" My voice cracked. "That's our safety net, Lucas. Sophie's college fund." "Trust me," he said, reaching for my hand. "When have I ever let you down?" I pulled away, remembering all the small moments I'd dismissed over the years. The whispered phone calls, the late nights at the office, the way his mother Carolyn always seemed to know more about our finances than I did. "I want to see the paperwork for these deals," I said. His smile tightened. "Come on, Victoria. You know real estate. It's all about timing and discretion. I can't just—" "Show me the paperwork," I repeated, "or I'm calling my father." The mention of my father, the retired tech mogul who'd never quite approved of Lucas, made him flinch. "You're being paranoid. This isn't like you." He reached for his phone. "Let me call Mom. She can explain how these investments work better than I can." That's when I knew. The casual deflection, the attempt to bring his mother into it. Classic Lucas manipulation. I'd seen him use these tactics on clients, never thinking he'd use them on me. "I'm going to find out what's really going on," I said quietly. "And when I do, Lucas, you'd better pray it's exactly what you're telling me." He stepped closer, his cologne suddenly cloying. "Don't do anything rash, Victoria. Think about Sophie." I was thinking about Sophie, about the life we'd built, about trust and betrayal, and the thin line between love and control. As I watched him head upstairs to say goodnight to our daughter, I made a decision that would change everything. I would find the truth, whatever it cost. And if Lucas had betrayed us, he would learn that some surprises cut both ways. My mother's dining room always felt like a stage set for a play about perfect families. Tonight, the crystal glasses caught the chandelier light just right, and the smell of roasted lamb hung in the air like an expensive perfume. But something was off. Maybe it was the way Lucas kept glancing at his mother Carolyn, or how my father Richard seemed more interested in his wine than usual. "Sophie tells me you're planning something special for the anniversary," my mother Elaine said, cutting into her lamb with surgical precision. "How mysterious, Lucas." I watched my husband's face, searching for any crack in his performance. Yes, Lucas. Why don't you tell everyone about this surprise that cost $60,000? Carolyn's fork clattered against her plate. 60,000? Oh, darling, you shouldn't have. Her laugh was too bright, too rehearsed. Though I suppose with Richard's new tech venture doing so well, it's hardly a stretch. My father looked up sharply. What new venture? The one Lucas mentioned, Carolyn said, her perfectly manicured hand waving dismissively. The investment opportunity you discussed last month? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I watched my father's face darken as he turned to Lucas. I haven't discussed any ventures with you, Lucas. Not since that disastrous attempt at flipping commercial properties last year. Lucas's charm kicked into overdrive. Just a misunderstanding, Richard. Carolyn must have confused it with another conversation. He reached for the wine bottle. More Bordeaux, anyone? I think we've all had enough confusion, I said, pushing my plate away. Mother, would you help me with dessert? In the kitchen, Elaine busied herself with the creme brulee while I gripped the counter, trying to steady myself. Something's wrong, isn't it? She asked, not looking up from her task. I don't know what's wrong yet, but I'm going to find out. She picked up the kitchen torch, the blue flame casting shadows on her face. Be careful, Victoria. Sometimes when you go looking for answers, you find questions you never wanted to ask. Back at the table, Lucas and Carolyn were huddled in conversation, their voices too low to hear. Sophie sat between them, pushing her food around her plate with the kind of concentration only a 7-year-old could muster. Daddy says we might have to move schools, Sophie announced as I set down the dessert. He says Grandpa Richard could help if you'd just ask. The room went still. Lucas's face flushed red. Sophie, sweetheart, that was supposed to be our secret, remember? What's this about moving schools? I kept my voice level, though my hands shook as I served the dessert. Sophie loves her school. It's nothing, Lucas said quickly. Just exploring options. Options we can't afford because someone emptied our accounts? The words came out sharper than I intended. Carolyn leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light. Victoria, dear, sometimes wives need to trust their husband's judgment. Greg and I learned that lesson years ago, didn't we, darling? Greg, Lucas's father, stared into his wineglass. Yes, and look how well that turned out. Perhaps, my father interrupted, we should discuss what's really going on here. Lucas, you mentioned needing investors for a new development project last week. Is that where Victoria's money went? Lucas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. I think it's time we got Sophie home. It's a school night. Sit down, I said quietly. We're not going anywhere until you explain why our daughter thinks she's changing schools. Because sometimes sacrifices have to be made, Lucas snapped, his charm finally cracking. Not everyone had trust funds and tech empires handed to them, Victoria. Some of us have to take risks to get ahead. The room fell silent, except for Sophie's small gasp. I saw my mother and father exchange a look I couldn't quite read, while Carolyn reached for her son's arm. Lucas, she murmured, not here. But the damage was done. In that moment, watching my husband struggle to rebuild his facade, I saw everything clearly. The missing money, the secret conversations, the subtle manipulation. It was all part of a bigger game, one I was just beginning to understand. Sophie, I said, go get your coat. We're leaving. As she scampered off, I turned to Lucas. But not with you. His eyes narrowed. You can't do that. Watch me. I stood, my chair steady against the floor. And Lucas, whatever game you're playing with my family's money, it ends now. As I led Sophie to the car, I could hear raised voices from inside. But for the first time in days, my hands weren't shaking anymore. The truth was finally coming out, one painful piece at a time. 3 days after the disastrous dinner, I found myself following Lucas's silver BMW through downtown. He'd told me he had a late showing, but his car turned away from the luxury condos he usually handled, winding through increasingly industrial streets until he pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse. I killed my engine, watching as he got out and greeted his father, Greg. They disappeared inside, and something cold settled in my stomach. Greg hadn't worked in real estate since his investment scandal 5 years ago, the one that cost his clients millions. The warehouse door hadn't quite closed. I slipped inside, my heels clicking softly on the concrete. Their voices echoed from somewhere ahead. "She's getting suspicious," Lucas was saying. "Victoria's not an idiot." "Then handle her," Greg snapped. "We're too close to let your wife's questions ruin everything. The investors are already nervous after what happened with the Riverside project." I pressed against a rusty support beam, my heart hammering. The Riverside project, my father's development deal that mysteriously fell through last year. "I've got it under control," Lucas said. "Once this deal closes, we'll have enough to cover everything. Victoria's trust fund alone." "Her trust fund?" Greg's laugh was bitter. "You really think Richard's going to let you anywhere near that money after what happened at dinner?" "He doesn't have a choice. I've already used Victoria's signature on the preliminary paperwork. As far as the bank's concerned, she's fully on board." The world tilted sideways. My signature. He'd forged my signature. A phone rang, the sound sharp in the empty space. "It's Carolyn," Greg said, probably wondering where her monthly allowance is. "Tell her she'll get it when we close the deal. I'm tired of supporting her shopping habit." "Watch your mouth. That's your mother you're talking about." "Yeah, well, maybe if she hadn't blown through your settlement money." I backed away, not needing to hear more, but my elbow caught a piece of metal, sending it clattering to the floor. "What was that?" Lucas's voice turned sharp. I ran. Behind me, footsteps echoed on concrete. I burst through the door into the evening air, fumbling with my car keys. "Victoria?" I turned. Lucas stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the warehouse interior. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "How much did you hear?" he asked finally. "Enough." My voice didn't shake. "You forged my signature?" He stepped closer, hands raised like he was approaching a scared animal. "I can explain everything." "Like you explained the missing money? Or Sophie's school? Or what really happened with my father's Riverside project?" "That's business, Victoria. You wouldn't understand." "I understand fraud." The word hung between us like a blade. "I understand that you and Greg are running some kind of scheme using my family's connections. What I don't understand is how I ever trusted you." His charm switched on like a light. "Baby, you're jumping to conclusions. Let's go home, talk about this properly. Think about Sophie." "Don't you dare use our daughter to manipulate me." I backed toward my car. "Not anymore." "Victoria, wait!" He lunged forward, grabbing my arm. The mask slipped, showing something ugly underneath. "You can't prove anything." I jerked away. "Watch me." "If you do this," his voice dropped low, "if you try to interfere, you'll lose everything. The house, Sophie's private school, your comfortable life. It all depends on my income. Are you ready to give that up over a few overheard words?" I thought about Sophie, about the life we'd built, about all the little compromises I'd made believing they were for the best. Then I thought about my signature on documents I'd never seen, about trust funds and forged papers and years of lies. "You know what's funny, Lucas?" I got into my car, rolling down the window to look at him one last time. "You spent so much time trying to get your hands on my family's money, you forgot to ask why I never touched it myself. I didn't need it. I have my own." His face changed as the implications hit him. I drove away, leaving him standing in the parking lot with his secrets and schemes crumbling around him. In my rearview mirror, I saw Greg emerge from the warehouse. They stood together, father and son, watching me disappear into the gathering darkness. They didn't know it yet, but I wasn't running away. I was getting ready for war. The private investigator's office smelled like stale coffee and secrets. Marcus Kane didn't look up from the manila folder as he spread photos across his desk, each one a piece of the puzzle I'd hired him to solve. "Your husband's been busy," he said, tapping one photo showing Lucas shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. "This is James Morton, convicted of investment fraud in 2019. Got out last year." I picked up another photo, Lucas and Greg entering a law office I recognized, my father's corporate lawyer's building. When was this taken? Tuesday. They spent 3 hours inside. Kane leaned back, his chair creaking. "But here's where it gets interesting." He slid forward a document, portions highlighted in yellow. Your signature appears on 6 different investment contracts in the past month, all notarized by the same person, a Nancy Chen. My throat tightened. I've never signed anything. No, Kane agreed. But someone did. And they're using these documents to access funds from your family's investment portfolio. The same portfolio your father used for the Riverside project last year. The pieces clicked together like a terrible puzzle. The project that failed because key investors suddenly pulled out. Pulled out after private meetings with your husband and father-in-law? Kane's voice stayed neutral, but his eyes were sharp. They're running a long con, Mrs. Bennett, using your family connections to build credibility, then taking the money and running. The Riverside project was just a test run. My phone buzzed, a text from Sophie's school. Parent-teacher conferences were today. I'd forgotten completely. There's more, Kane said as I stood. Your mother-in-law, Carolyn? She's been making regular deposits into an offshore account. Small amounts, nothing suspicious on its own. But over the past year, he showed me a spreadsheet that made my head spin. They're all in on it, I whispered. Not all. Kane pulled out one last photo. My mother, Elaine, having lunch with Nancy Chen 3 days ago. Your mother's been asking questions too. I left Kane's office with a USB drive full of evidence and a weight in my chest that felt like concrete. The school was quiet when I arrived, most conferences already finished. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Parker, looked concerned when I walked in. Victoria, I'm glad you made it. Is everything okay at home? I forced a smile. Of course. Why do you ask? Well, Lucas was here earlier, talking about moving Sophie to a new school. He mentioned some financial changes in the family. She hesitated. And Sophie's been drawing some interesting pictures in art class. She handed me a crayon drawing. A house split in two, dark scribbles filling one half. In the dark half, stick figures of Lucas and his parents stood surrounded by dollar signs. In the light half, Sophie had drawn herself holding hands with me. Children often express their anxieties through art, Mrs. Parker said gently. My phone buzzed again. Lucas, where are you? We need to talk about Sophie's education. I stood abruptly. I need to go. Outside, the autumn air felt too thin to breathe. I started my car, then just sat there staring at Sophie's drawing. My daughter had seen the truth before I had. Another text. Your father called. Says you've been asking questions. Don't do anything stupid, Victoria. The threat was clear, but something had changed. Maybe it was seeing Sophie's drawing, or maybe it was finally understanding the full scope of Lucas's betrayal. The fear that had been choking me transformed into something else, something cold and sharp and certain. I drove to my mother's cafe, the one where she'd built her empire from nothing. She was in her office, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed paperwork. I know about Nancy Chen, I said without preamble, and I know you've been investigating too. Elaine took off her glasses slowly. Took you long enough to figure it out. Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to see it for yourself. She opened her drawer and pulled out a familiar-looking USB drive. Now, shall we discuss how to make your husband regret the day he thought he could outsmart 2 generations of Bennett women? For the first time in weeks, I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, but then again, nice wasn't going to win this war. The annual Bennett family brunch was always a performance, but today felt like opening night. I watched Lucas work the room at my parents' country club, charming the usual crowd of family friends and business associates. Only my mother and I knew his smile was a lie. The Riverside development is back on track, Lucas announced, raising his mimosa, thanks to some creative financing and the support of my wonderful in-laws. My father beamed, completely taken in. I gripped my fork harder, feeling the metal bite into my palm. Creative financing? James Morton emerged from the crowd, and I saw Lucas's smile flicker. Fascinating approach, Bennett. Mind sharing the details? The room shifted subtly. Morton wasn't supposed to be here. I'd arranged his invitation through back channels, calling in favors from my mother's social circle. James, Lucas recovered smoothly. Didn't expect to see you here. How's life after, well, you know. Prison? Morton's smile was razor sharp. Educational. Taught me a lot about investment fraud. The patterns, the players, the paper trails. Carolyn appeared at Lucas's elbow, her diamonds catching the light. Lucas, darling, Greg needs you for a moment. Something about those documents? I stood up. What documents would those be, Carolyn? The ones with my forged signature. The room went quiet. Lucas's charm cracked for just a moment, showing something dangerous underneath. Victoria, you're making a scene. Am I? I pulled out my phone, projecting photos onto the dining room's wall screen, usually reserved for family slideshows. Like these scenes, images flashed. Lucas with Morton before his conviction, Greg destroying documents outside his office, Carolyn making deposits at offshore banks, the forged contracts with my signature. That's enough. Lucas moved toward the projector, but my father blocked his path. What is this? Richard's voice was deadly quiet. It's not what it looks like, Lucas started, but Morton cut him off. Actually, it's exactly what it looks like. Same scheme you pitched to me before I went away, isn't it, Lucas? Use the wife's family connections, forge some papers, move the money through shell companies. Carolyn's wine glass shattered on the floor. You promised you'd handle this, she hissed at Lucas. Handle what? My voice carried across the suddenly silent room. The theft? The fraud? Or just your wife who finally stopped playing along? Lucas's charm vanished completely. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done. I nodded to the back of the room, where 2 SEC agents stepped forward. I just didn't do it alone. You bitch, Carolyn spat, lunging for me, but Greg held her back. Don't, he warned. It's over. Lucas looked around the room, seeing the trap closing in. Then he smiled, not his usual practiced charm, but something cruel. Sophie will never forgive you for this. Sophie? I felt the blood drain from my face. Where is she? With Nancy Chen, he said softly. You remember Nancy, don't you? The notary? She's quite good with children. The room spun. Sophie was supposed to be at her piano lesson. I'd checked the schedule myself. What have you done? My voice didn't sound like my own. Insurance, Lucas said simply. Now, should we discuss terms? The SEC agents moved forward, but Lucas held up his hand. Careful. One call from me, and Nancy takes our daughter on a little trip. Victoria's choice. I looked at my mother, seeing my own fear reflected in her eyes. Then I noticed something else. She was typing on her phone, a slight smile playing at her lips. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Sophie safe. Piano teacher called police when Chen showed up. Girl in protective custody. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, then met Lucas's eyes. You really should have paid Nancy Chen more. Turns out her loyalty was surprisingly affordable. His face contorted, and for a moment I thought he might actually attack me. Instead, he laughed. A hollow, broken sound. Well played, Victoria. I didn't think you had it in you. That was your first mistake, I said as the agents moved in. You never really knew me at all. I watched them lead Lucas, Greg, and Carolyn away, their protests fading into the stunned silence of the room. My father touched my shoulder, his eyes full of questions and regret. But it was my mother who spoke first. Shall we get Sophie? I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The war was over, but somehow I knew the real battle, healing our family, was just beginning. The police station's fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and unreal. I sat across from Detective Martinez, watching her flip through the evidence I'd gathered. The photos, the bank statements, the forged documents, everything that proved Lucas's guilt. Mrs. Bennett, she said finally, you realize this complicates your custody situation. What do you mean? I have proof of his crimes. You also have proof that you knew about them for weeks and didn't report them immediately. She tapped the timestamps on the surveillance photos. A good lawyer could argue you were complicit. My stomach dropped. I was gathering evidence. While your daughter remained in a potentially dangerous situation? Her words hit like slaps. That's how his attorney will frame it. Outside the interview room, I could see Sophie through the window, coloring with a social worker. She looked so small. My phone buzzed, a text from Lucas's lawyer. We have a deal to discuss. Come alone. Don't, Martinez warned, seeing my expression. Whatever they're offering, they have everything, I said quietly. The house, Sophie's school fund, my reputation. What else can they take? I left the station, despite Martinez's protests, driving to the lawyer's office in a daze. The conference room felt like a trap, with Lucas sitting there in his orange jumpsuit, still somehow looking perfectly composed. Victoria, he smiled. I knew you'd come. His lawyer slid a document across the table. A simple arrangement. Mr. Bennett pleads guilty to reduced charges, serves minimal time. In exchange, he retains partial custody of Sophie and control of certain assets. You must be joking. Think about it, Lucas leaned forward. A long, public trial, Sophie testifying, your parents' business dealings exposed. Everyone loses. Except you. We built this life together, Victoria. You really want to burn it all down? I stared at the papers, seeing our lives reduced to legal terms and conditions. Something inside me cracked. You know what the worst part is? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. I actually loved you. Even after everything, some stupid part of me still wanted to believe there was something real. There was, Lucas said softly. There is. We can fix this. No. I stood up. We can't. His charm vanished. Sign the papers, Victoria, or I'll make sure everyone knows how you used our daughter as bait in your little sting operation. Is that what your mother told you? I pulled out my phone, playing a recording. Carolyn's voice discussing Sophie with Nancy Chen, planning to use her as leverage. Lucas's face went blank. Where did you get that? Nancy Chen wasn't the only one being paid to spy. I turned to his lawyer. I assume you'll want to revise your strategy. I walked out, leaving them scrambling. But my victory felt hollow. Outside, rain had started falling, and I stood there letting it soak through my clothes, trying to feel something besides emptiness. My phone rang. My father. The board's asking questions, he said without preamble. About the Riverside project, about our involvement. They're talking about a full audit. I'll handle it. How? You've exposed everything. Our reputation is worth less than the truth. I hung up, cutting off his protests. Another text arrived, from Carolyn. You've destroyed my family. I hope you're happy. I wasn't happy. I was tired, soul-deep tired. Sophie's drawing from school kept floating through my mind. The house split in two, dark on one side, light on the other, but now everything felt dark. My mother was waiting in my driveway when I got home, sitting on the steps like she used to when I was young and in trouble. Sophie's asking for you, she said. The social workers won't release her without a hearing. I did this wrong, I whispered. All of it. I thought I was protecting her, but you did what you had to do. She stood, offering her hand. Now comes the hard part. What's that? Learning to live with it. She squeezed my hand. Come on, I'll make tea and we'll figure out how to fix this mess. I followed her inside, leaving wet footprints on the floor. Tomorrow, I'd have to face the lawyers, the judges, the consequences of every choice I'd made. But tonight, I just needed to find my way back to the light side of that crayon-drawn house, where my daughter was waiting. The custody hearing felt like a funeral. I sat on one side of the courtroom, Lucas and his family on the other, while Sophie's future hung in the balance. My mother squeezed my hand as Lucas's attorney approached the bench with a familiar smile. Your Honor, we have new evidence regarding Mrs. Bennett's fitness as a parent. The judge nodded, and a video began playing on the courtroom screen. It showed Sophie in her bedroom, crying while I argued with Lucas in the next room. The timestamp was from 3 months ago, the night I discovered the missing money. Mommy says you're a liar, Sophie's voice wavered on screen. Are you going to leave like Jenny's daddy did? Lucas's response was gentle, practiced. No, sweetheart. Mommy's just confused. Everything I do is for our family. The video continued, showing more carefully selected moments. Sophie's tears, Lucas's comfort, my apparent instability. Each clip twisted the truth just enough to make me look like the villain. Furthermore, his attorney continued, Mrs. Bennett's recent actions demonstrate a pattern of paranoid behavior. I object. My attorney stood. This edited footage is irrelevant, I interrupted, standing, because I have something else. Lucas's smile flickered as I walked to the bench, holding Sophie's school tablet. Your Honor, my daughter has been recording her own video diary for the past year, with her art teacher's help. The new video played. Sophie's face filled the screen, her voice clear. Daddy told me not to tell Mommy about the money. He says it's our secret, like the papers he makes me help him hide. More clips followed, Sophie recording Lucas's late-night phone calls, his meetings with Greg, the way he practiced his lies in the mirror. Through a child's eyes, the truth was devastatingly simple. You used our daughter to spy on me? Lucas stood, his charm cracking. Victoria, how could you? I didn't. I met his eyes. Sophie did this on her own, because even at 7 years old, she could see what you really are. The judge called for order as Lucas lunged forward, but it was Carolyn who reached me first. You vindictive bitch, she hissed. After everything we did for you? Everything you did? I laughed, the sound sharp in the tense room. You mean like teaching Sophie to keep secrets? Making her afraid to trust her own mother? Your Honor, Lucas's attorney tried to intervene, but Sophie's voice from the tablet cut through the chaos. I love my daddy, she was saying, but he tells lies. Big lies that hurt people. Mommy says sometimes love isn't enough if it makes you scared all the time. The courtroom fell silent. Lucas stared at the screen, seeing his daughter's truth for the first time. His perfect mask crumbled completely. I want to speak to my daughter, he demanded. She needs to explain. No, the judge's voice was firm. Mr. Bennett, in light of this evidence and your pending criminal charges, I'm granting Mrs. Bennett full custody. Furthermore, but Lucas wasn't listening. He turned to me, his eyes wild. You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? Letting me think I was winning, while I what, Lucas? Protected our daughter? Taught her that the truth matters more than appearances? I stepped closer, my voice low. You taught her to record everything, to keep secrets, to play people's emotions. I just taught her to use those skills for the right reasons. The bailiffs moved in as Lucas's control finally snapped. This isn't over, he snarled. You think you've won? I still have nothing, I finished. You have nothing. As they led him away, I caught a glimpse of Sophie through the courtroom door, sitting with her art teacher. She was drawing again, but this time her picture showed a single house, whole and bright, with no darkness in sight. My mother touched my arm. Victoria, are you all right? I watched Carolyn and Greg follow their son out, their social standing and schemes crumbling around them. The victory felt different than I'd imagined. Not sweet, but necessary, like setting a broken bone. No, I answered honestly. But we will be. Outside, Sophie ran to meet me. Her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield that had served its purpose and could finally be set down. Together, we walked into the sunlight, leaving the shadows of Lucas's lies behind. The last box from Lucas's office sat unopened on my desk, its contents somehow heavier than the others. Through my window, I could see Sophie in the garden with my mother, planting autumn flowers in soil still warm from summer. You don't have to do this now, my father said from the doorway. He looked older since the scandal broke, but something had softened in him too. The lawyers can handle it. No, I said, cutting through the packing tape. I need to know everything. Inside, beneath files and photographs, I found a leather journal. Lucas's handwriting filled the pages, not with secrets or schemes, but with a detailed chronicle of our life together. Every manipulation, every calculated move, planned years in advance. The day we met hadn't been chance. He'd researched my family, positioned himself at that charity gala, rehearsed the exact words that would charm me. Even Sophie's conception was timed to cement his access to the Bennett fortune. Victoria. My father's voice cracked. I should have seen it. All those business proposals, the way we all saw what we wanted to see. I closed the journal. Even me. The doorbell rang. Through the window, I watched Carolyn step onto our porch, her designer clothes replaced by something simpler, less armored. "I'll handle this," my father started, but I shook my head. "No, this is mine to finish." Carolyn didn't wait for an invitation. "They're selling our house," she said as I opened the door. "Everything we own, gone because you couldn't let it go." "You mean everything you stole?" "We were family." Her voice caught. "Doesn't that mean anything?" I looked past her to where Sophie was showing Elaine how to plant bulbs. Promise buried in dirt, waiting for spring. Family doesn't use children as pawns, or forge signatures, or expose their own flesh and blood to prison. Her eyes flashed. "Lucas got 15 years because of you. Lucas got 15 years because of Lucas." I met her gaze. "But you already knew that, didn't you? That's why you're here. Not to blame me, but to ask for help." She flinched. In that moment, I saw what my mother had seen all along. The desperate need behind the manipulation, the fear beneath the facade. "I have nothing left," she whispered. "You have the truth." I handed her Lucas's journal. "Start there." After she left, I joined Sophie and my mother in the garden. The soil was dark under my fingernails as I helped plant the last bulb. "Will they come back?" Sophie asked quietly. "Like the flowers?" "The flowers come back because we take care of them," my mother said before I could answer. "We give them good soil, clean water, honest sunlight. No shortcuts." Sophie nodded, understanding more than a 7-year-old should. "Like telling the truth?" "Exactly like that." I pulled her close, breathing in the scent of earth and new beginnings. Later, after Sophie was asleep, I found my mother in her study, reviewing security footage from her cafes. The same careful attention to detail that had helped expose Lucas's schemes. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. "From the beginning, you saw what he was doing." She turned, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. "I saw what you needed to become. Sometimes love means letting people fight their own battles. Even if they might lose? Especially then." She smiled. "But you didn't lose, did you?" I thought about the journal, about Carolyn's visit, about Sophie's flowers waiting beneath the soil, about revenge and justice, and how sometimes they look exactly like truth finally seeing sunlight. "No," I said, "I didn't lose, but I'm not sure I won either." "That's how you know you did it right." She turned back to her screens, but not before I caught the pride in her eyes. "The real victories are the ones that change us." Outside, the autumn wind stirred fallen leaves across our garden. Somewhere in the dark, bulbs were taking root, preparing for a spring we couldn't see yet, but knew was coming. Like truth, like justice, like love that grows stronger for having been tested. I left my mother to her work and went to check on Sophie, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices between truth and comfort, between justice and peace. But for now, in the quiet dark of a house finally our own, that was enough.